thought it was the reverberation of your voice.
I guess so. I guess it's kind of fixed itself a little bit. But boy, it is the tail end of July, the dead of summer. It's hot out, but there are also signs in the skies. And Al, we're going to be talking about that today, aren't we?
Yes, today is a Signs in the Heavens day, and it's going to be a lot of fun. In fact, we already have our first guest on the line, so let me go ahead and introduce him. Folks, it is our pleasure to bring to you astronomer and historian, or historian of astronomy, Dr. Steve Ruskin, all the way from Colorado Springs. And Steve, you're here to talk to us about the Great Eclipse. So welcome to the Remden Road.
Well, hey, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah. Now, we wanted to talk to you about actually two great eclipses. There's the one that's coming up in just under a month on August 21st, that great eclipse that is going to cover the United States from the Pacific Northwest all the way down to South Carolina. But you have recently published a book about another great eclipse. So why don't you tell us about that?
Sure. Yeah, I'm happy to talk about the upcoming eclipse because I think it's going to be one of the most interesting events. I wouldn't say in our lifetime because fortunately there's another one in about 7 years that's going to go across America. But we haven't had a total solar eclipse in 40 years, and we haven't had one cross coast to coast in 99 years. So they are rare, at least over America, and so it's exciting. But the eclipse that I wrote my book about was an eclipse that occurred in 1878, so almost 140 years ago, and it occurred over the Rockies. And I call it America's first great eclipse because I think it was the first time in our history, the history of our country, that so many people, both tourists and astronomers, especially Americans, sort of gathered to witness it like we're going to do this year. A bunch of tourists went west, and that was before, of course, we had the highway system, so they were all just taking the new transcontinental railroad and some of its, the different lines, and then astronomers came out west too. So we'll talk a little bit about that. But yeah, I think, eclipses are exciting, and they really do an interesting job of bringing people together, and I think it's going to be neat.
Yeah, and of course there's always a lot of hype with a thing like this, and we'll get into that. In fact, let's just go ahead and talk about the hype of this great eclipse that's coming up in August. From time immemorial, folks have looked on eclipses as divine signs, perhaps signs of judgment or things like that. What do you hear about this eclipse and what people are saying?
Well, I haven't myself. I don't know too much about it other than what I've read, maybe like you all in the paper. But I think it sort of runs the gamut as you would expect from people from different denominations, whether Christian, Hebrew, or I don't know much about other faiths, but saying that we're here, this is it, or it's just another in a succession of signs, or some just kind of shrugging their shoulders and saying, meh, it's an eclipse. So I think it sort of depends on which, I don't know, I don't want to sound like I'm diminishing, but what sort of flavor of faith one is standing on at the time. But certainly people, and I think a sign from, or an eclipse you're right, has always been seen as a sign, even if it's just, sort of the majesty of the Creator, as many have put it, and I've got some interesting quotes from that 1878 eclipse as well. But I think an eclipse, from my perspective, and I did go to the University of Notre Dame. That's where I did my PhD. I'm not Catholic, but I did grow up Episcopalian, and when I was at Notre Dame, they're like, you're practically one of us. And it was important to me that I go to a school that that respected faith, and so it was neat for me. And I think the eclipse, an eclipse like this, is always a sort of source of wonder. And I think it's going to be a great moment of reflection for those who do have some sort of faith.
Well, I mean, a school that did have an effect on your faith, but also that has a great football team.
Yeah, I hear they do.
Well, indeed. So, I grew up in Alabama, and Notre Dame was always the bad guys. But
funny, you'd be surprised at how many schools say that, wouldn't you?
Yeah, but then how many schools say that about Alabama? So
yeah,
go
exactly
figure.
Right.
It's
Well,
all a
that would
matter
be
of.
justified, though. Yeah.
All right. Yeah. Okay. We'll just let that one pass. Well,
so Steve, is there anything aside from the fact that we haven't seen an eclipse coast to coast in 40 years? Is there anything unique about this eclipse aside from the couple things that you pointed out before? So do I look at the sky and say, okay, it's just another eclipse?
Well, it's I don't know if a total solar eclipse can ever be considered just another eclipse, especially for those. Some people dedicate their lives to chasing them all over the world. Now, an eclipse, a total solar eclipse, occurs somewhere on the Earth about every year and a half. So it's not as rare a natural phenomenon as one might think. However, sometimes those eclipses occur in the middle of the ocean. They occur only for a short time. Well, they're all fairly brief, but sometimes they're longer than others. And sometimes they're over the Arctic. So, it is rare to have them over a highly populated area, and it's also rare for us in America, like I said, to have one, that goes coast to coast, because it's been almost a century. The one that happened 40 years ago was mostly up kind of Oregon, Montana, and then out into Canada. It didn't most of the country didn't get to see it. So what's unique about a solar eclipse is if you're in the shadow path, that is, that band of shadow, the moon's shadow as it goes scurrying across the surface of the Earth, you actually see the moon completely block the sun for about 2.5, 3 minutes or so. And it's phenomenal. The day sort of turns to not quite dark night, but it's like a deep twilight. You see the stars come out, you see planets, and it's just really amazing. And so a total solar eclipse, if you're in the eclipse path, which this year will be about 70 miles wide from Oregon to South Carolina, you get a real treat, and it's pretty amazing. So.
Well, let's ask you about how to watch the eclipse, because quite frankly, I am planning to be in the middle of the path in South Carolina. My buddy Pete Rambo has said that his school district has canceled school for that day because it's going to cross just about the time that the school buses are running. So public safety feature there. So when I am there and the shadow of the moon passes over me, how can I watch this safely?
Right. Well, what you want to do, and I'll post on my website. I'll give you the address in a bit, but NASA has a link to there's 4 companies that make eclipse glasses, and you've probably seen them if you're near the eclipse path at all. And if you Google on Amazon or even Lowe's, my father came home from Lowe's the other day, all excited. He said, "Look, I got eclipse glasses at Lowe's, and we're here in Colorado. We'd have to go up to Wyoming to see the actual eclipse path, but so they're everywhere. But eclipse glasses, they're only a couple dollars, and they're paper and sort of a polymer lens. If you put them on in your house, you'd be bumping into walls. They're that opaque. But when you use them to look at the sun, you just see sort of this bright disk, but it won't damage your eyes. So that's all you need to do is get a good pair of eclipse glasses, and then experts say if you're in the eclipse path, during totality, those 2.5 minutes or so when the sun is completely blocked by the moon, that's the only time you can take off your glasses because you're not seeing direct sunlight. But that's the part that's spectacular because you see the sun's corona and it looks sort of like this wispy halo. And corona, of course, means crown, and that's one aspect of the eclipse that is often transposed onto God, and everything. So, but yeah, that's the way you want to look at the eclipse. You want to get some eclipse glasses. Otherwise, there's just no safe way to look at the sun, even if it's partially eclipsed.
Right, and we certainly want to make sure people do this safely.
Right.
Yeah, it's gonna be quite something. So let's talk about your book and that eclipse from 140 years ago in 1878.
Mm-hmm.
Who went to see it, and what were they saying about it?
Sure. Well, one way to segue into that, one thing that I think is kind of funny, we're talking about eclipse safety. Well, so a lot of tourists, American tourists, went west. In 1878, the Transcontinental Railroad had been finished not quite 10 years prior to that. The Civil War was over, and America was starting to feel a little, we were coming back together. We were in the middle of Reconstruction, and we were expanding westward. So the Rockies, where this eclipse occurred, the 1878 eclipse kind of came north to south. It didn't go coast to coast, but it came down over Canada, Montana, Wyoming, Colorado, Texas, and I think it brushed Louisiana and then kind of went out into the Gulf of Mexico and over Cuba. But so the Rockies, the little towns had just sprung up like Colorado Springs, where I was born and where I am right now. Colorado Springs only had about 5,000 people. Denver only had about, Denver had a couple tens of thousands, so it was really quite a small area. And Colorado had just become a state in 1876, so it was only 2 years old. So the train was the only way to get there, and everyone had heard about the Rockies and how beautiful they were, and it was becoming a summer vacation spot. So in 1878, when they heard there was tourists just started to flood the Rocky Mountain towns that had just been there for less than 10 years or so. And the towns were completely overwhelmed. They had no idea so many tourists would be coming. People ended up sleeping, hotel owners, when they were booked up, started renting out local livery stables, barns, so people could sleep in the stalls rather than putting the horses there. People were sleeping on billiard tables. People were sleeping on cots in the bars and things like that. So it was pretty crazy. And then I think at the end they ended up sleeping in tents and on sidewalks.
Wow. So this is, or at 1878, you're right, it's 10 years after the Transcontinental Railroad. It's still in the middle of the Wild West days.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so there are still wars going on with the First Nations tribes, particularly up to the north. I mean, the Nez Perce, the Lakota, and so on. How did that factor into all of this hype and craze?
Well, what do the Indians look at eclipses as like an omen or something? Are there more religious issues regarding an eclipse for them?
Those are both great questions. I'll take the first one and then go to the second one. Yes, absolutely. They were concerned about troubles with the Native Americans. There were problems with the Utes in southern Wyoming, and there were a number of eclipse expeditions that went to southern Wyoming because that's where the Transcontinental Railway went. Right through southern Wyoming, through places like Rawlins and Separation and everything, the Union Pacific there. So the eclipse, the astronomers had these giant telescopes, and they usually didn't set up camp too far from the railroad because it was just easier to do it that way. They just looked for a place on the map where a railroad and the eclipse path intersected, and they kind of said, all right, that's where we're setting up camp. So the problem was in 1878, there were these Indian troubles, as they called them. And so the astronomers had, in some of those areas like southern Wyoming, they did have escorts from the U.S. Army to sort of protect them. Now, there weren't any incidents between the astronomers and Indians, Native Americans, but yes, absolutely, there was a real concern about that, and the astronomers even joked about, they said, I'm not going to Montana, I don't want to be scalped, and tongue in cheek, I mean, they were somewhat, sincere about that. They were concerned about some of the risks. So they had those Army guards. Now, interestingly, to the second question, yes, we don't have any direct records of how the Native Americans themselves responded, meaning we don't have any first-hand accounts from those First Nations folks. But what we do have is second-hand accounts from the whites who watched the Native Americans observe the eclipse. And they're sort of typical, the whites, the whites, whether they were Europeans or Americans, called it the savage response, or said this is how the savages responded to the eclipse, and it was somewhat predictable in the sense of, they thought that it was their deity eating the sun, and they fired their pistols at it to scare it away, or they chiefs required, sudden. They had the women build up the bonfires, to try to brighten the day and things like that. I'm not saying that they're wrong, but I would have liked to have had. It would be neat as an historian if we had some sort of direct account from a Native American. Unfortunately, we just don't seem to have anything other than what the whites, whether European or Americans, observed the Native Americans doing.
Well, that sounds like a good line of inquiry. And before we go any further, Steve, we should ask about your website. And then I'm interested to know, how did you become a historian of astronomy?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, my website is First Great Eclipse. The book is America's First Great Eclipse, but the website is just First, F-I-R-S-T, greateclipse.com. and I'm on Facebook also at First Great Eclipse. And yeah, I put up, I try to post at least once a day, once every other day with anything new. And since your listeners are all across the country, I'll just make sure to repost some of the important eclipse maps so they can see where they need to go to get into the shadow path. But if you've got folks in Oregon, Kentucky, and South Carolina like you all are, those are some prime spots. But as an historian, I was just interested in, I've always been interested in the history of science, sort of how we got to where we are in terms of natural knowledge about the world. And interestingly, there are a number of schools out there, Notre Dame, Wisconsin, Minnesota, Cambridge, and England, who have graduate programs in the history of science or the philosophy of science. And so I was fortunate enough to get into Notre Dame after my undergraduate, which was here in Colorado at Colorado State. And I ended up working on history of astronomy, in particular voyages of exploration in the British Empire, astronomers that went out in the British Empire to do astronomical observations. So that's kind of how I ended up doing that. And when I came back to Colorado, which is where I'm from, I started investigating astronomy in Colorado and came across this eclipse, years ago, and have been kind of working on it ever since.
Well, as a historian myself, it's always interesting, fascinating to see what has attracted your attention and drawn you down this particular path. So let me ask a way back history of astronomy question.
I'll do my best.
Oh, sure. There was this guy named Galileo,
mm-hmm.
and this other guy named Copernicus, and
mm-hmm.
and another guy named Kepler. And 500, 600 years ago, there was this controversy where they said this strange thing that actually it's the Earth that rotates around the sun, not the sun that rotates around the Earth.
Mm-hmm. Weren't all those people contemporaries of yours, Al? I'm just wondering.
Well, no, that was actually like in my grandfather's day. But so anyway, the science that these gentlemen pursued all those centuries ago, that changed the nature of astronomy. Can you just describe what it was like back then, having to go up against the religious institutions, the political institutions, the scientific institutions, with this theory that is totally contrary to what most people are believing?
Sure. I mean, yeah, that could probably be a whole show in and of itself, or two or three. But the standard model up until Copernicus' time was called the Ptolemaic model, after Ptolemy, the Greek. And it was very much this notion that the sun is at the center of not only our solar system but the universe. And back then they didn't really differentiate. I mean, they didn't understand that the universe was quite as big as we know it to be today. I mean, not quite anywhere near as big. They just pretty much assumed that our planet, the sun, and the local planets in our solar system were, pretty much all there was, and that the stars were sort of in this sort of celestial sphere kind of at the edge of everything, and beyond that was, there were different ideas, but basically the realm of God and the angels and that sort of thing. Well, Copernicus, he didn't have a telescope like Galileo did. Galileo was the first to turn a telescope on the heavens, but Copernicus in 1543 published his book on the revolutions of the heavenly spheres, and he basically came up with a mathematical solution to the problems that they were having. When you have the Earth and all the other planets revolving around the sun, you can make it work mathematically. You can chart the courses, but it's very complex, because we know that that's not the reality. I'm sorry, I said the Earth revolving around the sun, the sun revolving around the Earth, and everything revolving around the Earth. But Copernicus said, hey, look, it makes a lot more sense, and it's a heck of a lot easier if we postulate that the Earth and the Moon and all the planets revolve around the sun. Now that, of course, went against church teaching, which had sort of glommed onto Ptolemy's model, because if you have the Earth at the center of everything, it sure makes it easier from a theological standpoint. So Copernicus's model, was seen as somewhat heretical, but he kind of hedged his bets and said, well, this is just a mathematical model. That's all it is. I'm just doing it to make things easier. But I think secretly he said, this makes a lot more sense. And then you get on to Galileo and Kepler, and they sort of advance things to the point where it really does become an issue. And I know I could go on, but yeah, they had to sort of break the stranglehold, I guess you could say, on what we would call cosmology that the church had sort of dominated for many years. And I'm speaking specifically of the Catholic Church at this point. So
yeah, and so that's just an amazing thing. And how long did it take from when Copernicus is teaching this as a theory to when it was finally accepted as truth?
Well, I guess you would probably, I would say that the first, it's probably a good 100-plus years, because I think by the time you have Newton taking everything that had come before, Copernicus's model, Kepler's laws of planetary motion, and Kepler was the one who, among other things, said, hey, it's a lot, Copernicus was one step, but things are a lot better if you have the planets moving around the sun in ellipses rather than circles, which we know is the actual way they move. Mathematically, he said that just makes a lot more sense. And Newton put it all together in his what's called his Principia, which was basically his principles of motion and gravity, where we get his equations for gravity, and he comes up with his theory of gravity and everything. And again, that's I'm just glossing over it briefly, but I think by the time we get to Newton, at the end of the 17th century, beginning of the 18th, that's when it's a working model, it's a working theory, and it's taken to be the true model of the universe, sort of despite what the Catholic Church said. And I think it obviously occurred more in Protestant areas where there was a lot more freedom to sort of make those speculations. So I think it took about 150 years for it to be sort of a widely accepted theory. And you could go back and forth and say, well, maybe not quite, or maybe there's this, difference. But I think that's probably generally most people would agree.
Okay, well,
widely, it's like 180 degrees in the opposite direction now, because the Vatican actually has their own Department of Astronomy. I think they have Mount Graham down in Arizona. They are headlong into the whole astronomy issue. I'd be curious to find out your thoughts on that. But we're entering a break here in just a moment. We got time for your website. What's your website again?
It's first, F-I-R-S-T, firstgreateclipse.com.
All right, firstgreateclipse.com, and your book is The First Great American Eclipse.
Yep, America's First Great Eclipse.
Oh, excuse me, America's First Great Eclipse. Yeah.
If you typed all those words into Amazon, it'd come up anyway.
And we just type in your name, Steve Riskin, and it'll come up as well.
Yep, should.
Yeah. So, all right. Well, our break is coming up in about 30 seconds. But Steve, the reason I was going back and asking all those questions about those ancient astronomers is they changed the way we look on astronomy today. And what you're saying in your book is that 1878 eclipse changed the way we look at astronomy. When we come back from the break, I'd like to ask you that question and find out what's different now than before 1878.
You bet.
So we will go to break. This is the Remnant Road on Hebrew Nation Radio. It is July 24th, and we'll be back in just a minute. Our special guest today, Dr. Steve Ruskin, who holds a Ph.D. in the history and philosophy of science from the University of Notre Dame. And specifically, Steve, you're specialize in the history of astronomy. And now I want to ask you something about your book. Steve is the author of America's First Great Eclipse, How Scientists, Tourists, and the Rocky Mountain Eclipse of 1878 Changed Astronomy Forever. So that's my question, Steve. How did that eclipse change astronomy forever?
Sure. Well, one interesting thing that came about studying this book is it made me realize that this was a pivotal point in the history of astronomy, not just for America, but for the whole world. And what it came down to is this. We talked a little bit about the history of astronomy with Galileo and Kepler and Copernicus and Newton. That was the first step to getting the model of the universe that we have today, basically, with some modifications. But, when it comes to astronomy, for centuries, astronomy was essentially a sort of positional science. That is, astronomers existed to get more and more precise measurements about the location of the stars, which enabled them to create accurate catalogs and charts, which enabled their national navies and their trade ships to get to where they needed to go around the globe as Europe was expanding in kind of the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries. So astronomy was a positional science kind of in the service of the Navy, and that meant most observatories were at sea level. Now, astronomers realized that they probably could see a little bit better if they were up higher, that is, out of the thick atmosphere that you get at sea level, where the light from the stars is kind of diffracted and dispersed. But they never really tried getting up on mountaintops until this eclipse, really. I mean, there were a few prior to, in 1856 and 1872, but the 1878 eclipse was the first time that so many astronomers, hundreds of astronomers, really had the opportunity to observe the stars and really the universe, distant galaxies and nebula from, of course they didn't know exactly what they were yet, but from high mountaintops, when they realized that, hey, we can see a heck of a lot better up here. And, the reason why that's important is because, think of, if you just picture an observatory in your mind now, you might think of, say, Mauna Kea in Hawaii, or some of those really high billion-dollar ones that you see in the science websites, and they're in Peru or Chile, or maybe in the Alps or high in China. And that's kind of our modern concept of an observatory. They're almost always going to be, when you picture them, up on a mountaintop somewhere or a mountainside, high above the atmosphere, because we just take it for granted that's where you can see better. This is, of course, now we've got telescopes on satellites and everything, but prior to that, everything was on mountaintops. But this 1878 was the point at which astronomers realized, hey, it makes a heck of a lot more sense to put telescopes up on mountaintops, and enabled them not just to do positional astronomy, but to do what they called the new astronomy, which was when they started to apply the new instruments of physics and chemistry, such as spectroscopes and photography and other techniques that would enable them not just to figure out where these stars were, changing from a positional astronomy to what the stars were made of, what the sun was made of, what the stars were made of. Using spectroscopes, they could actually analyze solar light to figure out what elements were inside those stars and inside the sun. So to wrap it up, it was basically the first time that astronomers realized, hey, it makes sense to be up on mountaintops. And after 1878, after this eclipse, you start seeing observatories popping up on mountaintops all over the country and then all over the world, especially through the 20th century.
Well, I'm so glad you brought up the sun, Steve, because I wanted to change gears just a little bit here. We never shy away from controversy here at the Remnant Room. So I'm going to ask you to participate, specifically because you are an historian, right?
Uh-huh.
And this might get you in a little bit of hot water because you're a scientist as well. So I don't want to get you on the outs with your peers. But we are entering into a solar minimum, as I understand it. And, as a consequence, they're talking about the Earth cooling. Now, we have this idea of global warming that has been propagated, throughout the news and science. But historically, because you are a historian, historically, have we seen other cycles of cooling? And is this reminiscent of those cycles?
Well, gosh, that's a good question. I'm probably not the best one to answer just because I am an amateur astronomer. And you're right. The solar activity does go in cycles where you see, increased activity in the sun, you see increased sunspots and then reduced sunspots, and all of that can be tracked. And I've read enough. The problem is, here's what I can say, I think, comfortably. Science, as an historian of science, science has always been political. Science, well, you like to think that science is an objective sort of thing. It's not always, and it doesn't mean that the facts of nature aren't objective, because I believe they are. I mean, I do believe I don't believe the Earth is flat. I do believe we revolve around the sun. Those sorts of things, but the knowledge that scientists produce has always been sort of taken up to serve various political ends. And I think that, you see the same sorts of things with climate science and that sort of thing. And I'm not taking a side here either way, but I do know that, scientists can easily take the same data set and come up with very different conclusions. Certainly, I know enough to know from sort of a layman's perspective that, absolutely, the Earth has gone through cycles of warming and cooling as well. Whether or not we're going into another cooling cycle, I would like that. But I'm probably not qualified to answer, at least in any way that would satisfy you guys or your listeners. But I do agree that science gets very political and always has for centuries.
Well, thanks for taking a shot at it anyway. But, as long as we're talking about controversies, you just touched on another one. And it is one that kind of drives me crazy, right? Because in some circles, this comes up all the time. I'm like, this is the 21st century. How can we think this way? So you mentioned the Earth being not flat. How do we know that? Historically, how do we know that? Come on, aren't they all just making that stuff up?
Making what stuff up?
That
you mean like
round?
Well,
the Earth is round. They're just making that up, right? I mean, we don't have any historical evidence that the Earth is round.
Well, if you're willing to believe, say, that physics works the way it does, that satellites do in fact orbit, that say, the moon landing wasn't faked, which I'm willing to do only because, granted, I have not been on the moon, I have not been up in space. I've been in planes, and I got off, got on a plane in Denver and ended up in a place called Sydney, Australia. At least that's what everyone was telling me. They talked a little funny, and it sort of matched up with what I've been told. I'm willing to believe that model makes more sense than sort of more of a flat Earth kind of model. And I know that seems to have a sort of resurgence, and I'm not here to put anyone's beliefs down, but the models that we have seem to explain more, and that's always sort of the development of theories of science is the more that can be explained and the more future predictions that a theory makes, the more it's considered to be valid, right? And so I'm willing to go with the sort of round Earth and gravity model. And that's just me.
Well, I only ask you the question because it's one of those that drive me crazy. I mean, we have evidence of around Earth, and people will believe what they want to believe.
Yeah.
I happen to believe the Earth is round simply because we have pictures. So, but we have pictures from space even about what the Earth looks like. And speaking of pictures from space, I was wondering from historical an astronomy historical model, how did the Hubble telescope really change the way we look at things? And if you could look forward a little bit, what do you think is the next great thing in astronomy coming our way?
Oh, yeah. Well, I think some of the most, and you're right. And, I was sort of saying all that tongue-in-cheek because I always want to tread sensibly. Not with you guys, I know, but, there are, this flat Earth thing is, like, there's a resurgence in the flat Earth philosophy. I even saw a newspaper here in Colorado. There's this weekly gathering up in Fort Collins. But anyway, so, yeah, I mean, the Hubble telescope and these telescopes that are now outside of the Earth's atmosphere, I think, are the next step in terms of, how we come to understand the universe after, this great eclipse of 1878 and realizing that these mountaintop observatories were good. And, they probably had no concept of being able to get above the atmosphere. But now that we can, these Hubble telescopes, or the Hubble and other telescopes that are being launched, are just fantastic because they allow us to see so far back, so deep into the universe, which is basically looking back in time. If you subscribe to the expanding universe model, which, is sort of the working model for cosmology, and they allow us to get pictures of the universe pretty much at the moment it began, and so they're just absolutely fantastic. Plus, I think they just show these pictures, say from the Hubble. There's these fantastic. You can go on the web, you can go on NASA, you can see these beautiful coffee table books. But the images of from the Hubble and other telescopes, I think, just show how amazingly beautiful the universe is. I don't know what you guys think, but that's one of the things that blows me. It gives you a sense of awe and wonder that I think you just simply can't get any other way.
It does, and it gives me a sense of awe at the Creator to know that He did that. I mean, it just blows my mind. Speaking of controversies, I mentioned Mount Graham in Arizona, the Vatican. Steve, what the heck are they doing down there? You have any idea?
Well, I don't. You mean in terms of what's their research objectives?
Right. Yeah.
I don't know, but I will say this: to the history of the Vatican Observatory in general, I think is pretty impressive. The Vatican Observatory, from when it was founded in the 19th century, or at least when it was sort of growing in the 19th century, really sort of took a stand for science against some of the more reactionary thinkers of the day. So, and it's been a while since I've read about that, but I remember that they kind of stood tall in pursuing some of the more modern models at the time versus the more reactionary sort of closed-minded doctrines that were being pursued. So the Vatican Observatory, even though it's always been part of the Vatican, has had sort of a bit of a rebellious streak. But I know Brother what's his name? I think the head of the Vatican Observatory is going to be. He might be in Kentucky for the eclipse. But there's
he'll be at Hanukah. I'm thinking about making my way to Paducah, Kentucky, because that's going to be the.
I'm trying to remember. I mean, I read a story, but anyway, the Vatican. So I know they have their observatory in Arizona, like you said, and they've got some different. The Vatican Observatory has always been sort of a strong research partner for other. With other observatories around the world and other astronomers. One nice thing about scientists in general and astronomers in particular is I think they have a very international, strong-knit community and always have, and it's transcended boundaries of politics and even religion and controversy. And I think that's something that I find neat about science, the history of science, is that astronomers, even during times of war, have sort of tried to work together, even when their countries were, fighting tooth and nail. So.
Well, I mean, and that really reminds me, how closely do astronomers work together? You mentioned the large telescope in Hawaii, the observatory in Hawaii, which is phenomenal. But there is one down in Australia, one in Brazil. How closely do these guys work together with regard to, their various issues of research? And is there anything in the very near future which you've seen where you think they may, come out with something hot off the press, if you will?
Oh gosh, I mean, there's always something hot off the press, right? I mean, there's always something interesting. They're talking about like alien megastructures and this one distant star. I can't remember the name of it, but anyway. But there's always something new. So I can't predict what's going to happen next. I just I love reading space.com and National Geographic and other places that cover space news. But yeah, I think these telescopes, first of all, as I discussed, these telescopes are billion-dollar enterprises, and they usually require, if it's not a big country like China or the USA, it's often the European Union will work together and with say Chile, the government of Chile, and so basically what happens when you have these multinational research projects for building observatories, the time on the telescopes gets parsed out to those countries and the institutions that are participating, and so they share these telescopes, and so there's some collaboration right there. And then astronomers, of course, get together at their academic conferences. You've got your infrared astronomy, and your those who study black holes and those who study, say, dark matter, and they're always sort of cross-pollinating their ideas. And while there's certainly some competition, there are research groups that probably are, trying to get the first, using their research time on telescopes to get new data to come up with new theories or whatever. So there is some competition. I think that you take it up a level, and I think for the most part, astronomers and scientists in general tend to try to work together, because that's how the science advances, whether they're all Americans or all all over the world.
And this is what I appreciate from what you've been saying, Steve, is you're articulating what I understand to be the proper role of science: to investigate phenomenon, to report on it, to try to explain what it is we're seeing. But really, science, philosophy, and religion, they are connected. But the scientist can't do what the theologian does. The theologian can't do what the scientists do. I would submit that they need each other, though.
Yeah, I mean, if you're sympathetic to theology, and you guys obviously are, and I am, I think that's probably right. There are some who are violently opposed on both sides, saying, well, the scientists know nothing, or the theologians, are just playing, a fool's game. I prefer a middle ground, because I sort of prefer a middle ground on everything. I mean, I think there's enough controversy in the world, and I think it's nicer to get along. And I know that sounds maybe a little trite, but, and I guess going to Notre Dame, which was a very ecumenical sort of university, and it was open not only to advances in science, realistic advances in science, not just sort of twisted for theological purposes, but also, very sincerely believing in taking their faith seriously. I always found that a nice place to be, and people just tended to work together better. And so I was very fortunate to have gone to a school like that, even though I myself was not Catholic. And I could read something interesting if we have a few minutes left.
Yeah,
I was going to ask you some of those quotes that you mentioned from the the clips.
One neat quote that I found back in 1878, after the eclipse was over, the newspapers back then were a lot less self-conscious about faith. You could find scientific descriptions right next to a paragraph on a sort of reflection on God or faith or whatever. And so from the Colorado Springs Gazette, which was the paper in Colorado Springs at the time, and it still exists. But a few days after the eclipse, they sort of combined the view of the solar corona, which again is Latin for crown or wreath or whatever, and and how it sort of made them reflect upon God. And so they had this. They invoked some of the great English poets as they recalled the sun's disappearance behind the moon and the appearance of the solar corona, which pops out only when the moon is blocking the rest of the light of the sun. Anyway, they said this. They said, quote, "The subtle influence of this scene on the observer cannot be described. We were all impressed with the thought that Jehovah lives and rules in the heavens. It was not total darkness. A dim religious light prevailed which told us of God's glory and power. All could say with holy George Herbert, 'Who hath praise enough? Nay, who hath any?'" And that dim quote from dim religious light comes from John Milton's Il Pensiero. So, anyway, it's interesting to see a news report on the eclipse sort of, in the next paragraph segueing into this sort of reflection on faith and God's meaning for the universe, God in the universe and that kind of thing. I just thought it was really neat. So.
Well, that does sound neat, and I expect in about 3 weeks' time or 3.5 weeks, when I'm standing under the eclipse in South Carolina, to experience kind of the same thing. Before we go, we got about 5 minutes left. Steve, could you explain once again how to watch the eclipse safely on August 21st and where to find more information about it?
Oh, right. Yeah, and that reminds me, I was going to mention something about 1872. But yeah, so you want to get these very inexpensive eclipse glasses. I'll post it on my website, the NASA-approved manufacturers, but they're only a couple dollars. You want to get them now before they sell out, or at least before they become scarce. But again, my father found them at Lowe's the other day, so that's good. But in 1878, they didn't have these eclipse glasses. They took pieces of broken glass and held them over an open flame, right? So to cover them with soot, like a candle flame or an oil lamp or something. And so they created what they called smoked glass. And I wouldn't recommend that because it doesn't block the sun's intense radiation as well as these eclipse glasses. It's what they did back then. But it had a disastrous consequence. One woman in Boulder, or the Boulder area, her husband was out working in the field, and the eclipse was coming, so she made this piece of smoked glass over a lamp in her kitchen, ran the piece of glass out to her husband. They both watched the eclipse, and when she came back, her house was engulfed in flames because she forgot to extinguish the lamp. So an unfortunate side effect of making smoked glass in 1878. So the eclipse glasses today, they're only a couple bucks, and they don't require open flames, and they're just a lot safer. So that's what I'd recommend. But on my website, First Grade Eclipse, I'll post a link to the NASA, they have a safety website or a website dedicated to eclipse safety, and there's a great, they have a great discussion of the eclipse glasses there. So.
Well, I'm sure there's also a website, I think, that you can actually watch the eclipse as well on the internet, so that you don't have.
Oh yeah, probably. Yeah, I know it'll be recorded because a lot of people won't be able to make it into that eclipse path where the sun's actually blocked by the moon for those few minutes, and so most of the 48 states, the contiguous 48, will be able to see a partial eclipse, and that's that's not quite the same as seeing a total eclipse, but yeah, those who can't get into the eclipse path will be able to watch it online, probably in multiple sites. So.
Now that last eclipse 40 years ago, that was visible in Southern California. Is that right?
Yeah, in the 1979 eclipse, I think went over part of Washington, Oregon, then over Idaho, and then kind of curved up into the Dakotas and into Canada. So you could, if you were in that area, you would have been able to see the total solar eclipse. But yeah, I remember as a kid seeing it in partial eclipse from Colorado, and yeah, Southern California would have been able to see it too. What happens when you're outside of the eclipse path is you see, depending on how far north or south you are, the further you go, the less the more of the sun, you'll see, the less of the sun the moon will cover as it kind of goes across the face of the sun. So it's called a partial eclipse.
I do remember that 79 eclipse as a boy, and
yep.
I wasn't exactly a boy, I was a teenager in 79, but it was very interesting, and I wouldn't say that it was life-changing, but certainly it was really interesting. Anything that you think would be life-changing with this eclipse coming up? Anything specific to look for, something that our audience could really, gravitate to and maybe keep in mind as they're viewing the eclipse?
What I would really recommend, if at all possible, to try to get into that eclipse path. And I'll post a link to the map again. It's all over my website, and it's all over the web, really. If you get into that eclipse path, where you get the couple minutes of totality, where the moon completely blocks the sun, it's just to see this. It's almost like people describe it as sort of opening up, the clock of the universe and looking into the gears, because when the sun's blocked in the middle of the day and the stars are out and the planets, you're almost like looking to the heart of the solar system and how it works. What a moving thing to see, for a few minutes that probably stretch into an eternity as you're there, seeing the sort of the solar system uncovered. And I think the other neat thing about it that I've kind of stated elsewhere, some articles I've written, is that it's a chance for us to get together, look up and stare at something that we're all experiencing, turn off our cell phone screens, and just kind of be quiet together. And I think that's something that we need right now, our country especially.
Absolutely. Steve, we're running out of time, so how about your website information and any other information you'd like to impart one more time?
You bet. The website is firstgreateclipse.com. I'm on Facebook at First Great Eclipse, and I'll post some of my stuff there, and that'll feed to my website. And then you can get my book on Amazon as well, America's First Great Eclipse, Steve Ruskin. And I hope people check it out. There's also an audiobook version for those who like to do it that way. So.
All right, thank you, Dr. Steve Ruskin. We will be back in just a couple minutes with another guest to talk about Signs of the Heavens. This is the Remnant Road.
Undisclosed is I call it a novel of faction. It's not fiction, it's faction, because it's woven around the truth, and the truth is basically disseminated to the reader in digestible bites. And this truth deals with the 70 years of lies that have gone with UFOs. And how I got into all this was that on Saturday night, December 14th in 2013, at about 11 o'clock at night, my wife and I were driving home. We'd gone out to dinner and a movie, and as we're driving through our neighborhood, we noticed something bizarre moving toward us in the night sky. There were these pale amber lights, like nothing we'd ever seen before. They were moving in staggered pairs. There were probably about 8 to 12 of them, and they were flying about 1,000 feet off the ground, very slowly, very silently. And as they just about passed over us, we could see the saucer shape of the outline of their saucer. And then as we watched, they just flew off into the ether. They just disappeared into a higher dimension. And it was amazing. And then we'd never had a sighting like that. And 3 nights later, we had dinner with the world's foremost authority on UFOs and extraterrestrials, Dr. Stephen M. Greer. Dr. Greer has briefed 2 sitting presidents. He's briefed members of the CIA, CIA director, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, members of Congress. And, of course, the first thing out of our mouth was, you never guess what happened to us. And of course, he just smiled and said, this happens to him a lot, that people he's meeting for the first time are sort of being checked out by these interstellars.
Huh. That's reminiscent of the Phoenix Lights, as a matter of fact. Al, as a matter of fact, it's interesting that he calls his books faction. Steve, you don't know, but I'm a writer as well. And it's interesting, this whole show that we're doing today, because this show is kind of a Signs in the Heavens show. On the cover of my first book, there's actually an eclipse with the number 3. The book is, it has to do with the name of the book. But in that book also I talk about UFOs and aliens, and one of the things that the approach that I take is not unlike yours, and is that these things are actually seen pretty often by reputable people, and yet it's something that is absolutely discarded by the mainstream. I mentioned the Phoenix Lights. The former governor of Arizona saw the Phoenix Lights when that happened, and yet when somebody hears about UFOs being sighted, they automatically think of people in foil hats and little green men. Is that an accurate depiction of the phenomenon that's going on now?
That's 100% accurate, because what happened was, we got to go back to where this all started. I mean, these interstellar species, and there's literally dozens of them. There's not one particular species. They've been visiting this planet for a long time, but what happened was during World War II, things escalated because we had learned to split the atom, and so we were doing these atomic bomb tests, and those atomic bomb tests were sort of like the neighbors discovering that the kids next door had started playing with gasoline and fire. And, that's why they came here out of concern. And they first showed up in these as energy drones, which the Army called Foo Fighters. These Foo Fighters were these energy drones that would shadow both bombers on both sides of the war, the Germans and the Allies. And they were unmanned, but they were essentially UFOs. And then, of course, we detonated the atomic bomb over Nagasaki and Hiroshima, and that just escalated things more. And then these UFOs started buzzing our Air Force bases, especially the one in Roswell. And why in Roswell? Because Roswell's Army Air Force Base had been the home of the 509th Bomber Squadron, which was the only wing in the world that was equipped with atomic weapons. So, again, that's why they were here. And what happened at the end of June of 1947, the military at Roswell had this new weapon, a scalar weapon, which was scalar is a longitudinal wave that's not limited by the speed of light. It actually travels at multiples of the speed of light. And when the Army hit them with this radar scalar weapon, it knocked down 3 of them. 2 of them collided and went down over Corona, New Mexico, and the third one wasn't discovered for 2 more years over Horse Mesa. And they were able to. There were bodies that were recovered, and there was one that was still alive.
Right.
So now, Steve, you had. Yeah, I just wanted to point out, Steve, you said at the top that we are 70 years into this, and yes, we are. 1947. In fact, it was July 8th, 1947, that the big headlines appeared in the paper of the Army Air Force capturing a flying saucer. So after 70 years, there's still the controversy. Is it real or is it not real? Well, you have an experience from 4 years ago, and I presume that was near your home in South Florida, right? That you had your... Okay. And these things are not going away, so what's the truth?
Well, the truth is, I mean, and this comes from hundreds of eyewitnesses who were in the military, the defense contractors, the intel services, members of NASA, the FAA, that have come forward to meet with Dr. Greer and give them their testimonies, because they want the same thing, which is what we want, which is these ships were reverse engineered, and they have these energy technologies called zero-point energy that enables them to travel in higher dimensions, to travel through space, and also it's a clean energy form that would basically eliminate fossil fuels. And big oil doesn't want these technologies out. So these technologies, when a scientist discovers these, have a breakthrough, and Tesla was the first one who had the breakthrough into zero-point energy, essentially their work is confiscated. They're denied patents. In some cases, their lives are threatened. Several have been killed. I mean, these groups that are in charge of this stuff, they don't mess around. In fact, the former CIA director William Colby he was a member of this group, Majestic 12, that decided to come forward to meet with Dr. Greer and give him an energy technology that they had black-shelved, and $50 million in seed money, and Colby wound up being killed, and his body was found in the Potomac River. This was like a week after he was supposed to meet with Dr. Greer.
Mm-hmm. Well, I got to tell you, Steve, obviously I do think that the phenomenon is real. We tend to look at it from a biblical perspective, and so you and I may disagree as to who these beings are, who they are, but I don't think there's any question that there's something going on. And I have a friend, a family friend. They live in Michigan. They came out to visit us in Southern California. We do what most people do. We took them to the beach, and I remember standing. She's at the time in her 30s, late 30s, mother of 3, and her husband is off playing with the kids. I'm sitting there talking with her, and I began to talk about the UFO phenomenon. And she said a very interesting thing to me, and I think it's typical about most people. She said, well, I don't believe in UFOs. I said, how can you not believe in UFOs? I mean, there's all of this evidence that there is something going on. I just don't believe. And it would have been more accurate to say that she couldn't believe in UFOs because it affected her paradigm. And isn't it true that, you know, in order to think along these terms, you have to look at the world and the universe differently? Isn't that true?
You know, that's very true. That's right on the nose because, you know, if I were to ask you if you believed in God, you would probably say yes. And the reason you believe in God is because we were taught to believe in God, and we were taught that it's okay to believe in God. In fact, it's encouraged. And yet UFOs, there's much more physical evidence than there is, you know, of God, that God exists. So why is it that we don't believe in UFOs? Because we were taught not to believe in UFOs. Because in the 1950s, in 56, when Eisenhower became president, he appointed Nelson Rockefeller to establish a secret agency called MJ-12, and their goal was to make sure that people, you know, you have these UFOs flying all around, and how are they supposed to handle it? Well, if you believe in these things, you're ridiculed. If you're a scientist a legitimate scientist who wants to investigate these things, your grant money is cut off. They made it impossible for people to believe in these things because you were just going to be ostracized if you did. And yet people have these sightings, and they do believe because they've seen them, like myself and my wife. And they realize, you realize that this is a peaceful entity and was created by the same God who created us.
You mentioned Dr. Greer, and I think he was involved in the disclosure conference that occurred.
Yeah, he was the founder and creator.
Right. So do me a favor, and because this is an area where this particular show doesn't really go into all that often, but explain to the audience what disclosure is, what was the purpose of that conference, and where we are at today with disclosure.
Well, Dr. Greer is a physician who was running an ER in North Carolina when he was compelled to move forward with investigating this matter. He had two experiences that affected him. One was a near-death experience when he was a teenager, and one was a sighting of a UFO with friends of his when they were young. And so he figured out that in order to see, we have to look at things the way that we're sort of limited in a bottle as far as technology, but there's greater technology than we have out there, and in order to traverse the galaxy with 0-point energy, you're moving in higher dimensions, but you're also communicating in higher dimensions. You're communicating through thought energy, and he realized that if thought energy was the way that an extraterrestrial communicated, then we could communicate with them. So he started something called CE5, which is Close Encounter 5 training, which basically gathered a group of 20 or 25 people in a meditation circle, and they would remote view their location to any passing starships, and by communicating through thought energy, they would get responses. And he had a huge response in one of his first episodes in Tampa Bay. The Tribune wrote up a big article because there are actually these ships that were vectored in. And the military was keeping an eye on him, and so a group who was working with President Clinton came to him and said, the president wants to know about Area 51. He wants to know about UFOs, and could you brief him? So he prepared a briefing for Clinton, and he prepared a briefing for Obama and for several members of the CIA and Congress. And so in the event that you're talking about, that you asked me about, happened in May of 2001, the Disclosure Project, where a group of, actually there were 20 scientists, there was members of NASA, there was members of the FAA, defense contractors, and the military and intelligence had come forward to testify in a 2-hour program, which you can watch on YouTube, that these things not only exist, but that the secret's being kept, the truth is being kept about these high-tech energy programs called zero-point energy that can change our world, that can replace fossil fuels, that can prevent climate change from happening, that can end poverty, can end hunger in the world, and yet they're being kept from us by the 1% that controls this stuff and doesn't want the world to change.
Well, indeed, that's true. There are a lot of people who would not like to see the world change. Quite honestly, Steve, I am trying to understand what is the truth in the matter. And my buddy Daniel, I think, has done a really good job trying to weave together a narrative to understand where does the UFO phenomenon fit in what I could say reality. But how do we account for it? And we had a guest on just the last hour, Dr. Steve Ruskin, and we asked him a question, which I'll ask you now. There's an observatory at Mount Graham, Arizona, run by the Vatican, and there are a lot of allegations about what might be going on there, a lot of them from the conspiratorial side saying, well, the Vatican is in contact with aliens. What do you think is really going on?
But before you answer that question, Tom Horn and Chris Putnam did a book, Vatica Exocan or something like that. But you know, they actually were in the observatory viewing heat signatures through the Lucifer device, which is a infrared telescope there, and they were stunned by the activity in the heavens of UFOs. And when they had asked the individual, the astronomer that was babysitting them in this facility, he said, "Oh, they get in the way all the time," meaning the UFOs would always got in the way of the astronomers' work. So, to Al's question, what is it that they're doing at Mount Graham, and do you think that perhaps they are not actually saying exactly what's going on?
Well, I'll answer the last part of that question first. Yes, they're not divulging anything that's going on. The Vatican, there were eyewitnesses that came forward and are quoted and unacknowledged, and and the information disseminated in the book Undisclosed as well, that deal with Vatican secrets and the existence of these extraterrestrials. And one of the most shocking things for me to learn because I was given exposure to all these testimonials to write both books, is that there are extraterrestrial moon bases on the moon, on the far side of the moon, and that when the Apollo 11 astronauts landed, they knew that they were going to be greeted, and they had created B-roll to interject with the live transmission in case these extraterrestrials showed up, which they did. Basically, we are quarantined as a species until we become enlightened as a species, more spiritual as a species, that we're not killing each other. One of the implications of why they're here and why it's important is that, we're destroying our planet systematically. You may or may not believe in climate change, but it's happening. We're destroying our oceans. And there's a real danger that we can eradicate ourselves as a species. And these interstellar species don't want that. They don't want our planet destroyed because Earth is an incubator of life, and so that's a major reason that they're here.
Well, that is one line of reasoning. I'm not sure we might see quite the same on what the goal of the aliens are. But what would be the point of covering it all up? Why not be open and above board?
Well, they are up and above board. They're not. I mean, my wife and I saw them flying clearly, as you can see your board flying over us. They're not covering up their presence, but they're not interested in landing on the White House lawn either.
No, I'm thinking. I think he's actually speaking about the governments of the world. Why are the governments of the world not being above board? And if I could handle that, it's simply because of power. It's because I think anyway, that if the populace understood what was really going on, then the governments of the world would lose some of their power. So it's my opinion anyway that the hesitancy to come forth with disclosure and be above board with what's happening on with the alien phenomena is simply because of a power and a political issue. Would you agree with that, Steve?
I would agree with that with one caveat. Most people in the government, the president, the members of Congress, aren't aware of this, or if they are aware of it, they're not going to come forward because they're going to be ridiculed if they do. They're not going to be elected if they do. And it's all about holding on to power for them. Whereas the people who really have access, the people who, because there's something called an unacknowledged special access project. There are these USAPs that the President and Congress have no ability to control. Most of them have no idea they even exist. And they control these programs, and they fund these programs through the Pentagon and through Black Ops programs, and to the tune of about $80 to $100 billion a year. And they're unless you have a need to know, you don't know these programs exist. Even the people who are working on them are so compartmentalized that they don't understand that they exist. And yet 70% of the people that are working for these groups want these energy technologies to come out. So why don't they let them come out? Because the 30% who control them are basically sociopaths who have the ability to execute them if they get out of line. So it's a crazy situation, but it's preventing our species from evolving right now, because we should have had clean, free energy that replaced fossil fuels 50 years ago. But it's being prevented because the people in charge don't want to change the world.
Well, we're actually coming up on a break right now, but it's interesting that you bring this issue up because my partner, Al McCarn, is actually retired Colonel. Al McCarn, his last posting was at the duties, was at the Pentagon as a duty station. Al, have you ever heard of a program or anything like this?
Well, I know that there are boxes within boxes, and yes, there are special access programs that, they are what they are, special access, and you have to have a need to know, but even there are boxes within boxes, and I certainly didn't have access to everything there is. Let's take this up on the other side of the break because, we've got a minute to the break, so we're good. I once again misread the clock.
You actually just reminded me of something, though. I was in the Air Force in the 80s, Steve, and I was actually stationed at Malmstrom Air Force Base in Montana. And there were stories of a launch control facility and its missiles being shut down by a UFO. At the time, I was relatively young and I didn't pay attention to it, but this story has actually come out more and more these days about the kind of power that these beings wield. So if you can talk a little bit more about that on the break on the other side, that would be great. Audience, you're listening to Hebrew Nation Radio, the Remnant Road, Daniel Holdings, Al McCarn. We will be right back with our special guest, Steve Elton, in just a moment.
Steve Alten, ALTEN.com.
All right, Steve Alten, and there we can find out everything about you and about your books. And let me just ask you about how did you get into writing?
Well, when I was 35, I had read a Time magazine article in the summer of 1995 about the Mariana Trench and how it was the deepest part of the ocean, and that there were hydrothermal vents that created life at the bottom of the ocean. And I had always been a big shark fan, and there was the biggest shark in history was called Megalodon, and it went missing mysteriously about 1 million years ago, and I sort of married the two ideas of the Megalodon being in the Mariana Trench, and did some research and set a goal to write a book, and worked at night from 10 o'clock at night till 3 in the morning and on weekends because I had a job, which I call a JOB, just over broke, and was struggling to support a family in 5. And on Friday the 13th in September of 1996, I went to work I was a general manager of a meat company, and learned out that I had been laid off, and went home, and we had no money in the bank. And 4 days later, my first book, Meg, went out to New York, the New York big publishing houses, and started a bidding war for it, and so that became my first book. And 20 years later, we finally have a movie deal that's coming out. A movie's coming out about Meg on August 10th in 2018, a year from now, starring Jason Statham and Ruby Rose.
Well, it sounds like quite a thriller. In fact, looking at the titles of your books and all, I can tell you I have certainly enjoyed science fiction since I was young. I have certainly enjoyed good, gripping novels and thrillers like the ones that you have written. So I might have to pick up Meg and some of these others. But your latest book, Undisclosed, how is that different from what you've written before?
Well, all my books sort of are faction being fiction wrapped around the truth, but nothing like Undisclosed, because Undisclosed I was giving access to top secret interviews between defense contractors and military advisors and eyewitnesses to UFOs and the truth behind them, and so my deal with Dr. Greer was that I would help him write his book Unacknowledged, which is the actual testimonials and historically laid out, and I would be able to use that information to create my thriller, which is Undisclosed, which sort of disseminates the information in digestible bites for the reader while keeping them entertained.
Cool. And so is this a good introduction for the person who has never looked into the UFO phenomenon before?
And doesn't believe it. Yeah, absolutely, because the hero of the story, Adam Shariak, who's a veteran of the Iraq War and is appointed Undersecretary of Defense under the Trump administration, and this all takes place in real time, by the way, in 2017, he doesn't believe in these things, and yet he is compelled to bring out zero-point energy, which is the technology we were discussing that can change the world, that's been black-shelved, and he's appointed because they believe that he has the ability to bring this stuff out, and his fiancée works in one of these subterranean bases under this USAP program, an Unacknowledged Special Access Project, and deals with these technologies. Of course, he doesn't know that.
Yeah, now let's talk about technologies just a little bit. There are those out there who would say that the tremendous advance in technology that we've had in the last 70 years has been due to alien technology. What do you think?
Well, when it comes to fiber optics and technology used in the stealth bomber, that's absolutely true. There are defense contractors have come out that work for Skunk Works that will have testified that this technology was reverse engineered from these UFOs that were downed.
Yeah, that is indeed the thing I was getting at, and I'm pretty sure that this is something you cover quite thoroughly in Unacknowledged, you and Dr. Greer. How about the speculation, allegations, however you want to say it, that there might be NASA and other programs which are far more advanced than the publicly acknowledged space program is? Are we, in fact, able to travel to the stars now?
That's a great point, because there's a quote in both books from Ben Rich, the former CEO of Skunk Works, who basically said, we have the ability to take ET home. So there's actually two different space programs. There's the horse and buggy space program that NASA trots out every once in a while, and there's the Lamborghini that's been locked into the garage that we're not allowed to bring out. And one of the reasons that we're not allowed to bring it out is we've been actually quarantined that these interstellar species will not allow us to travel across the galaxy because we are not ready for it. We have not matured emotionally as a species to stop killing each other, to that we would be a threat to other species if we were allowed to travel. And so even though we have the technology that we reverse engineered from their technology, they won't allow us to travel.
Well, it's an interesting point because at the tail end of last year, I did an extensive research project for someone regarding this kind of technology. And it was a fascinating endeavor in that there are many things that the public does not generally know about that we, in fact, have, I should say. You mentioned scalar weapons, as a matter of fact, that they had in the 40s. It's advanced technology, and yet, we had it in the 40s. What do we have now? Here's my point. When we talk about technology, why is it that the same technology that we launched people in to go to the moon is the technology that we were using as late as the early 2000s with the space shuttle? The very same technology. Why is it that we hadn't seen a jump in technology, as technology does? Technology jumps. So why hadn't we seen a jump in technology or space travel in 30 or 40 years? And I think I know what your answer would be.
Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Well, it's a great point, and the truth of the matter is we have the technologies to jump to cure diseases, to prevent hunger, to change the climate change on our planet, but it would directly interfere with the current technologies that are being exploited, which is fossil fuels. The coal industry, but more importantly, the big oil, are not going to allow these things to be done, and they have the power to bribe and control the USAP programs. The people who are in charge of these USAP programs, there are oil CEOs involved in this, and they will not allow the few to sacrifice for the many. So, it's horrible to say, but we have these technologies to explore the galaxy, but we are not allowed to bring out because the same energy technologies that would allow us to explore space would replace fossil fuels.
Well, so you mentioned zero-point energy, and I know what it is because I've written about it, but for those in the audience that don't understand what zero-point energy is, what is it? How can you explain it to them in layman's terms?
Well, that's a tough one, but I guess it gets its name from the fact that at minus 270 degrees Celsius or 0 degrees Kelvin, that's the absolute lowest temperature in the universe. And according to the laws of Newtonian physics, all molecular activity at absolute zero should not exist. But when our scientists, including Dr. Hal Puthoff, measured absolute zero, instead of finding an empty vacuum, he was shocked to find out it was, to quote him, a seething cauldron of energy, a plenum of space where every square centimeter was filled with matter. And so he named that zero-point energy, and it's a zero-point energy that subatomic particles jiggle and then literally jump in and out of existence. And what is actually happening is that the photons are colliding and being absorbed by other subatomic particles, and by tapping into this energy realm, we're able to have basically an infinite amount of energy at our disposal. And Tesla was actually the first person who discovered this. And Tesla, in 1901, was preparing a big test. He was going to use the planet's magnetic field as a giant dipole in order to broadcast electricity to ships at sea without using wires. And that experiment would have led to free energy and changed the world But here's what happened. J.P. Morgan intervened, and J.P. Morgan was a wealthy industrialist who had invested in copper wire to use in homes and businesses, and he wasn't about to give that up. So he had his buddies in Washington, D.C. shut down Tesla, confiscate all the scientists' papers, and basically leave them destitute. And it's this pattern that's been repeating itself throughout human history. Every scientist that has ever figured out how to tap into the zero-point energy field is shut down or silenced by the powers that be. And you have to realize that, you see, it's not just enough to invent a zero-point energy device. You also have to sell it to the right people who won't quash it. Otherwise, you might manufacture the design yourself, and that requires money. And you still need a patent to protect your property. And that's the second problem, because Section 181 of the U.S. patent law states that the government is allowed to arbitrarily determine if a technology or a device poses a danger to our national security. So you've got these rogue elements within the Defense Department, the CIA, the NSA, the Federal Trade Commission, the Department of Energy, that basically have used Section 181 to shut these scientists down. There was a guy, T. Henry Moray. His breakthrough work was ignored by the Patent Office. T. Townsend Brown, which was the father of electrogravitics. We could have had flying cars if T. Townsend Brown was given a patent, because he discovered that by using high voltage, he could, with zero-point energy, he could actually levitate a vehicle off the ground, which is how these UFOs fly. But Big Oil wasn't about to deal with the competition of zero-point energy, so they shut them down.
Well, audience, at least you think that Steve is making this stuff up. There's a very famous experiment called the Kashmir experiment, where they actually, it's a simple thing. They put two plates in a vacuum, if I remember correctly, and technically, there's not any activity in there. Well, they saw in this experiment, and maybe I'm not doing the experiment justice, Steve, but they saw molecules or atoms moving in and out of our universe. They saw these molecules leaving and coming back in this vacuum, and technically it should happen. So these things that you're talking about are not far-fetched. They are things that are actually happening as far as zero-point energy goes. It does exist. They don't understand it, but it does in fact exist. And again, like so many things that we are preconditioned for, you have to have a willingness to have your paradigm changed. There's an interesting story. I remember when Obama got into office, Will Smith, the actor Will Smith, took his son, Jaden Smith, and they were relating this story, how they met the president. He took his son with him, Jaden Smith, to the White House. And one of the things that happened in the course of that conversation with the president, Jaden Smith asked Will Smith, "Are you asking Dad? Ask him." And Will Smith saying, "No, never mind. Don't worry about it right now." And so Obama says, "Ask me what?" And then he winks and says, "About the aliens." So and then he says something like, "I cannot confirm nor deny, what's going on." And he said it in a way to give the impression that they were in fact real. But the point is that even the powers that be understand that there is a phenomenon going on. You mentioned.
Let me follow up with that story. It was something very pertinent, because when Obama became president, he wanted to know about these things, so he began making inquiries about these energy technologies and these and Area 51 and places like that. And what happened was he flew to Norway with his family to accept the Nobel Prize. And when he was out there, the powers that control this stuff, as a warning to Obama, launched a scalar weapon. And you could actually go to YouTube and type in...
you talk about the Norway spiral?
The Norway spiral. That blue spiral was not a weapon test by the Russians, as they claimed. That was a scalar weapon that was shot off while Obama was in Norway to warn him that, hey, you better back off, because we can take out Air Force One anytime.
Huh. Well, and I remember reading about this, that they actually rushed into a bunker when that occurred. And it was the night before his receiving the Nobel Prize. Nobel Prize.
That's right, because if these presidents are afraid to bring this stuff out because they don't want to happen to them what happened to JFK.
Well, there's even been sightings at the Capitol building. There's a picture from the 50s, and it's a very well-known picture of UFOs landing on the Capitol building. There have been, as I said, sightings by prominent people. What's his name? Buzz Aldrin, former astronaut to the moon, has made known his thoughts about UFOs. So UFOs are actually discussed and believed in by a vast majority of people that are in the science realm or in the astronomical realm. The question is, who are they? And you believe that they are. I happen to believe. Well, so let me ask you the question: are they benevolent or are they malevolent?
If they wanted to wipe us out, they could have done so at the blink of an eye. They're here to help us evolve. They're here to prevent us from destroying our planet. And before we went on break, you had mentioned Malmstrom Air Force Base. Well, there's an incident that is dictated. There's a testimonial from Captain Robert Salas of the U.S. Air Force in Unacknowledged, and it's referenced in Undisclosed. And he says in March of '67 he was at Malmstrom Air Force Base, a missile launch officer for the Minutemen missiles, and they had a call that there were strange lights flying in the sky, and basically what happened was the entire base, the nuclear weapons program at Malmstrom, was shut down when these...
So if I can just add to the story...
Yeah, please.
The base, because I used to work on Minutemen, 2s and 3s, so I know the site well, I know the base well, I was stationed there. So the missiles themselves, audience, are way out in the middle of nowhere. They're in the flatlands of Montana, but they're missiles, right? So they don't want any obstruction when they go to take off. There's something called a launch control capsule that controls the missiles. The missiles don't actually have anybody in the silos, just the missiles, and you go down there to maintain them. And I'm not going to talk about numbers or whatever because that's classified, at least it used to be, and I don't want to get in trouble. But the point is that this person, Captain Salas, was a launch control officer. He was buried in a capsule way down in a hole, and he was in charge of being, we call them capsule jockeys, because they were in charge of launching missiles if there was a war. So what you're talking about is this whole flight. We call them a flight of missiles, meaning that this whole section of missiles that this one launch control capsule was in charge of went down. It absolutely went black. And I can tell you, as somebody that used to work on the things, that's impossible. There is no way that you can, because they're redundant systems, Steve. I mean, there's backup generators, there's backup to the backups. I mean, the fact that Salas says that everything went down, it's insane. It's insane. Not insane as in crazy, insane as this really did happen, because there's evidence of that in the record. There's evidence in the record. But the fact that it happened in the way it happened is mind-blowing. I mean, it is absolutely mind-blowing.
And while we can talk about it on your show, we couldn't talk about that on Fox News or CNN or 60 Minutes because the powers that be will not allow this story to break over the masses.
Yeah. Well, and again, it's the idea of audience if we're willing to have our paradigm shifted. And there are many things that I have come to believe over the years, and many of you have shared my walk with you, audience. During the course of being on the Remnant Road, many things that I've come to believe about the Bible, about who we are, and that kind of thing. But I had to be willing to have my paradigm shifted. Now, and Steve, please, I mean no disrespect to you. I just have to give a caveat here to the audience. When the opportunity came to interview you, I consulted with my friend Al McCarn. Al McCarn is open-minded, but he's not nearly as read as I am in these issues because I've written about these things, I've interviewed about these things, I've talked about these things. And so I thought it would be a wonderful thing for us to be able to have this discussion with you, to see a whole different side of what is really going on. Now, you and I, again, I think probably would disagree as to who these beings are and what their intent are. That's okay. But the very fact that they exist, we can agree on. And I think, audience, that this is the important point. One of our goals this morning in bringing you the signs in the heavens, this particular show, is so that you understand that the world and the universe is not exactly how we've come to understand it. That it's much different than, the way that we were raised, and even in our biblical view. So don't get me wrong. I think the Bible is absolutely true. I think the Torah is absolutely right. I think Yeshua is who Yeshua is. I think the Father is who the Father is. I believe all of these things, but at the same time, I believe that there is a phenomenon that cannot be discarded simply because of the evidence. Because people like Steve Alton is seeing lights in the sky, along with the governor of Arizona, along with astronauts in outer space. So the phenomenon, Steve, is undisputable, I think. And in order to start down this journey of seeing what is possible, the audience has to open their minds and to be willing to look at something different than their own paradigm. And we only have about a minute left. So in order to change that paradigm, I mean, your book on the issues, it's a fiction book, is a great place to start. Again, how does the audience get your book? Where can they find it? And what other information would you like to give to them?
Let me just add something to what you said, because I think it's so critical and so important. Undisclosed starts off 20 years in the future when disclosure has happened, and it shows the world the way it can be, and I think that's important for your audience to see what we could have if we just...
Wonderful. I'm sorry, we're out of time. Steve Alton, check out his new book. You're listening to Red Road. Daniel Owen, Del McCarr. We'll be back next